That afternoon, the waters off Virginia were as still as glass, yet down by the small harbor, the air was tense, tight as a drawn bowstring. An 80-year-old veteran, his silver hair catching the light, his hands trembling ever so slightly, sat quietly in an old wooden skiff, the only thing he had left from his years of service in the war. But it wasn't just a skiff. It was memory. It was a promise. It was the last thread binding him to the fire-swept days he had once lived on open seas. But because he drifted into the wrong channel, the Coast Guard stopped him. And under the eyes of onlookers, he was forced to bring his boat ashore. The shame showed in his faded eyes, eyes that had once witnessed comrades fall in silence. What happened next? What made the Navy, just 1 hour later, send an entire fleet of small vessels to escort that skiff back to the water, bringing an entire community to tears? Subscribe to Veteran Best Stories to step into this unforgettable journey, a story of honor, memory, and the recognition that came too late, but not too lost. His name was Luther McNeel, a silver-haired man, slender but still standing tall, living in quiet solitude in an old wooden house nestled along the shores of Chesapeake Bay. At an age when most had chosen rest and retreat, Luther began each day with a solemn ritual. He would gently wipe every worn plank of his small wooden skiff, then softly push it into the water, as though releasing a piece of memory into the rippling tide. He didn't row out to fish, nor did he seek the sunrise like so many elderly men did. Luther rowed toward the sea to be near the waves. That soft, rhythmic murmur wasn't just water lapping against the hull. It was the tender voice of the past, the familiar call of days when he stood shoulder to shoulder with fellow sailors, beneath roaring engines and skies laced with gunpowder. His boat, worthless to some, nothing more than a weathered relic, was, to Luther, a witness to a life once lived. In 1969, during a brutal clash in the Pacific, he survived aboard that very vessel. Back then, it was a lifeboat, the last thing afloat when his patrol ship was struck by enemy fire. A shard of shrapnel scorched one side, leaving a charred black mark. They told him to replace it. He refused. He called that mark a scar of honor, an unerasable proof of survival, of loyalty. The villagers knew little about him. They simply called him the old man who talks to the sea. Many had seen him, under blazing noon sun or at dusk, sitting still in his skiff, gazing into the distance, as if in conversation with those long gone. Some said he was odd, others said he was lonely, but few knew that every whisper he sent out to sea was a tribute, a remembrance, for those comrades who never returned. Men who fell before they reached 30, men whose names now only remain as fading letters etched on cold stone. Luther never explained. Every afternoon he quietly wiped the boat again, his aging hands trembling but precise, almost sacred in their movement. To him, caring for the skiff wasn't about maintaining wood. It was keeping a promise. A vow he once made to his best friend, that if he ever made it home, he would never let their shared legacy fade into silence. And then, one bright summer noon, everything changed. That day, instead of returning when the sun was high, Luther rowed farther than usual. Silently, he steered the old boat past the anchorage into deeper waters, where the waves grew wild. A breeze picked up, light but uneasy. A strange tension spread over the bay. A few people at a seaside fish shack began to notice. One woman, the owner, squinted out toward the horizon and muttered, "Why is he going so far?" Before anyone could guess, something unexpected happened. Luther's skiff began to wobble. A strange sound echoed from afar, not loud, but enough to make the locals leap to their feet. A sleek, modern Coast Guard patrol vessel appeared, speeding toward him. A stop order blared from the loudspeaker. A young officer stepped to the bow, pointing directly at Luther, as if identifying a threat. No one understood what was happening. An old man, alone in a wooden boat on a calm day, what harm could he possibly pose? But in that instant, past and present collided in a powerful, silent crash. Luther didn't resist. He simply raised his head and looked at the young men in uniform, as if searching their faces for someone he once knew. The incident shook the entire town. Even as he was escorted back to shore in silence, his expression never changed. Only his eyes seemed to shine, not with fear nor confusion, but with something deeper. A reckoning, perhaps. Or the quiet realization that a promise was finally reaching its end. Beneath the shimmering sunlight of Chesapeake Bay, the old skiff floated beside the patrol boat, a silent emblem of memory that refused to fade. And Luther, the man bearing the scars of another era, once again faced the truth. But this time, he was not alone in the waves. A Coast Guard patrol vessel surged forward, shattering the mirror-like calm of Chesapeake Bay. Red lights spun above, casting flickering halos onto the water, like wounds weeping into the tide. The voice from the loudspeaker rang out, sharp, cold, slicing through the breeze like an unquestionable command. "Small craft, stop immediately. You are entering a restricted zone. This is a military and transport channel." Luther McNeel flinched. He lowered his oar. His shoulders tensed as he tried to steady the skiff against the churning wake from the larger ship. Lifting his gaze toward the patrol boat, he parted his lips to whisper an apology. But the wind carried his fragile words away, leaving only silence and misunderstanding in their place. He raised his hand and pointed toward shore, signaling he would turn back. But the patrol boat did not wait. It advanced, cold, unfeeling, as though approaching a potential threat, rather than an old man with veined hands, sitting in a sun-bleached vessel worn down by time, salt, and war. Then, two young officers stepped onto the deck. They didn't approach slowly, as one might when facing a living relic of history. They moved with precision and purpose, eyes cold, trained for protocol, untouched by doubt or delay. One gripped Luther's arm. The other grabbed the side of the skiff, pulling him to his feet. He shook his head, resisting, not forcefully, just as someone unwilling to be torn from something sacred. Yet still, they lifted him away. His feet slid across the edge of the boat, his hand releasing the wooden rail like saying goodbye to an old friend, with no promise to return. The skiff rocked, then drifted, empty, directionless. On the shore, people began to gather. They didn't know what was happening. Some raised their phones, recording the moment like it was some strange midday spectacle. An old man escorted away as if he'd done something terrible. A few turned their faces down, unable to meet his eyes void of anger or resentment, only filled with an old sorrow, as if he had seen this before, in another place, in another time. No one spoke up for him, because no one had a reason to object. The law was the law. That stretch of water was off limits to civilians, and his skiff, though brimming with memories, though bearing the marks of war, was not exempt. But between what is right by regulation and what is right by the heart, sometimes the distance feels as vast as the ocean. In that moment, everyone felt it. Something was wrong, not because a rule was broken, but because a man's dignity had been. Wrong, because a veteran was torn from the vessel that had once carried him through hell, under open daylight, in plain view of uniforms too new to remember. Silence settled like fog, stretching across the pier. No one defied the order, yet no one could forget what they had seen. A frail, solitary man being pulled from the fragments of his past. A man who once wore the uniform with pride, who once stood tall amid fire and steel, now treated like a disturbance to public order. Luther said nothing. He walked between the two officers. His feet touched land like it was his first time returning to a world he never truly belonged to. Not since the war. The wind blew from behind, as if trying to pull him back, to the sea, to the battered skiff, to the moment when loyalty still had a name. No applause, no salute, no words of greeting, only eyes, dozens of them, watching, not fully grasping what they had witnessed, but sensing something had just been lost. A respect, a piece of history, a sliver of human dignity, and the skiff remained, adrift by the dock, like a silent witness to wounded pride. Some looked at it. None dared approach, because it was no longer just a weathered boat. It was a symbol, a scar, a fragment of a man's soul, now caught between invisible lines drawn by law and the quiet ache of the human heart. As sunlight still hung over the bay, glinting off each ripple like shards of broken glass, a young soldier stood on the deck of the patrol boat, his eyes fixed on the frail old man being escorted away, and something inside him shifted. He had never met Luther McNeel, but the image of that scorched wooden skiff, the upright posture amid sea and sky, and the quiet, almost breathless composure of the man reminded him of a story told many times during training. A story of a Navy veteran during the 1969 Da Nang campaign, a man who had single-handedly piloted a skiff through a bombing zone to rescue fellow soldiers. It was always told with a hushed reverence. That hero never accepted medals, never appeared on television. He simply lived quietly, as if sacrifice were something expected. And now, the image of this old man in the worn boat, aged, trembling, fit, with painful precision, the memory of that forgotten name. The young soldier turned swiftly, stepping into the command cabin. Without hesitation, he sent an urgent report to the nearest naval base, including images and a detailed account. In his heart, he wasn't sure what would happen next, but instinct told him this wasn't just a matter of restricted waters. This was about a soul and an overdue act of honor. Less than 30 minutes later, at a naval base just a few miles away, an emergency meeting was called. Lieutenant Colonel Olivia Hart, known for her discipline and unshakable command, sat at the head of the table. Her dark hair was tightly pulled back, her gaze always razor sharp. But today, as the screen displayed footage of Luther being led through the dock, she froze. The pen in her hand stopped mid-motion. Then, slowly, deliberately, she placed it on the table. She knew him. Not from files, not from ranks or awards, but from a vivid memory of her days as a cadet at the Naval Academy. Back then, Luther McNeel had been an honorary instructor. Not loud, not commanding, just calm, composed, with a voice like a sail guiding ships through storms. He was the one who taught her that at sea, the most important thing wasn't the map. It was holding course when everything around you screamed to surrender. And now, that very teacher, the man who had shaped generations of officers, was being treated like a violator. Not because he resisted, but because he kept a promise to the waves. Because he still rode that same skiff, the one that had saved dozens of lives, to stay close to his memories. Olivia needed no further reports, no approvals from above, no explanations. In her eyes, some things required no protocol. Some people didn't need defending. They deserved reverence. She rose. Her voice wasn't loud, but it carried the certainty of a command. Return him to the sea, with full honors. No one in the room dared object. The young officers nodded, as though they had just learned a lesson not found in any textbook. About honor, about gratitude, and about the sacred duty worn by those in naval blue. Within minutes, a vessel was deployed. No sirens, no fanfare, just a solemn, deliberate preparation, like a ceremony about to begin. Because returning a man like Luther to the sea was not merely returning him to his boat. It was restoring something no one had the right to take away: the dignity of a soldier who had given his life to freedom. And in the distance, where the old man still sat quietly by the dock, his gaze fixed on the open water, as if speaking to the souls of those long departed, he didn't yet know what was happening. But a new wind had begun to blow, and this time it carried not just the scent of salt and sea, but the long-awaited breath of recognition. As the ships sliced through the water and drew closer, gentle whirlpools rippled outward beneath the crowd's anxious gaze. The low, steady hum of engines echoed around the harbor, not aggressive, but solemn, like the sea itself was keeping time for something sacred about to unfold. 3 patrol vessels and a tugboat aligned in formation, approaching with the precision of an honor guard. The American flag atop the mast fluttered softly in the breeze, casting flickering reflections across the surface of the bay. Lieutenant Colonel Olivia Hart stood at the bow of the lead vessel. Her eyes never left the man seated on the worn wooden dock. Luther remained still, frozen between memory and the present. His weathered skiff lay beside him, its hull darkened by years and salt, the old burn mark etched like a scar across the wooden skin. He did not turn his head. His gaze remained fixed on the sea, the place where he had sent off countless memories, where comrades had fallen, and where he still believed he belonged. The crowd packed the harbor, silent enough that the sound of a gull's wings could be heard slicing through the air. Those who had once filmed now lowered their phones. Only one live stream remained, still broadcasting, without commentary, without need for explanation. The story spoke for itself. As the ship docked, Lieutenant Colonel Hart stepped ashore. She did not walk quickly. Each step carried the weight of deep respect, not for rank or regulation, but for the man who had once taught her how to hold steady when the world tilted. In front of Luther, she stopped. There was no command, no display, only a look, full of emotion, and a small, reverent bow. "Sir, I'm sorry for the mistake." Her voice low, just strong enough to cut through the breeze, just loud enough for those nearby to hear. "We're here to take you back, to where you belong." No one spoke. The same Coast Guard officers who earlier had pulled him from his boat now stood silently, pressed against the railings. They were no longer enforcers of protocol, but students, learning a lesson in reverence, not from textbooks, but from a pair of eyes that had witnessed both glory and grief. Luther did not reply, nor did he stand, at least not right away. But something shifted in the stillness of his stare, a faint quiver at the corner of his eye, a flicker of light behind the veil of age. Eyes that had long since dimmed with disillusion now shone with something else. Acknowledgement. A feeling he hadn't let himself hope for in years. No one on the dock looked away. They didn't know who he had been in the war, didn't know what he had done. But in that moment, they knew one thing for certain. This man was not in the wrong, and now he was being restored to his rightful place, not with medals, but through a silent act of meaning. Lieutenant Colonel Hart extended her hand, not in pressure, not an invitation, simply as a wordless promise that he would return to the sea, not as an old man clinging to the past, but as a soldier who had never left the front line. He rose slowly. Each movement seemed to carry fragments of memory, each step dissolving into the heartbeat of a harbor holding its breath. No one spoke, yet it felt as though the whole dock moved with him, as if every gust of wind, every ray of sun was guiding him back to the place he had always belonged. And when he crossed the line between dock and deck, every eye lowered, not in submission to a man, but in reverence to a truth that had once been forgotten. That there are those who, though never asking for recognition, deserve to be remembered by an entire nation. The old skiff, once dragged ashore like a piece of evidence, was now lowered into the water in an entirely different way, not by force, but as part of a solemn ceremony. The tugboat crane lifted it slowly. Its hull rose gently from the wooden platform, suspended in the air between two American flags mounted in perfect symmetry. In the slanted light of late afternoon, the darkened, weather-worn planks took on a sacred glow, as though every crack, every scorched groove was telling a story that had never been written down. No extra noise, no laughter, no chatter, only the faint creak of the lift's mechanism and the steady rhythm of waves brushing against the ship. As the skiff touched the water, a soft click echoed, the latch released. The skiff rocked slightly, then settled on the surface, like a soul returning to where it belonged. And then the procession began to move. Leading was the Navy-marked tugboat, followed by 3 patrol vessels in formation, encircling the small skiff where Luther sat. He did not steer. The oars rested beside him. He simply let the skiff drift with the convoy. A soft breeze moved through his silver hair. The golden rays of sunset lit the contours of his weathered face, thin but resolute. Along the harbor, hundreds of townspeople stood shoulder to shoulder, watching as if bidding farewell to something sacred. No flags were distributed, no chants rehearsed. Yet every face reflected a quiet, genuine reverence. Applause broke out, unprompted, unending. Some wiped tears. A few small groups began to sing the national anthem, the notes imperfect, but filled with pride. No one expected a moment like this on an ordinary day in Chesapeake Bay. No one thought a simple wooden skiff could bring an entire community into such harmony, not for power, but for memory, for a long overdue acknowledgement. As the convoy reached the center of the bay, the waves grew stronger. The tugboat came to a halt. The 3 escort vessels slowed and held their positions, forming a dignified clearing upon the water. The wind quieted. The sky seemed to lower itself, waiting in reverent silence. Lieutenant Colonel Olivia Hart stepped onto the deck, one hand steadying her cap. Her eyes scanned the officers, then settled on Luther, still motionless in the skiff. There was no stage, no backdrop. But everyone knew this was a ceremony, a tribute that needed no invitation, no speeches, no generals' names announced, only one declaration, broadcast through the tugboat speakers, echoing into the open air like a voice straight from the heart of a nation. We honor Sailor Luther McNeel, who has preserved the memory of this country with his very soul. The moment hung heavy. The wind returned, gentle, full of feeling. Then came 3 solemn chimes from the ship's bell, one by one, deep, clear, resonating as if striking through the water into the depths of history. Each toll felt like a knock on the pages of memories long forgotten. No one clapped, no one sang, only silence, like the kind held during a flag salute, except this time, it was for a man. Luther bowed his head. No one told him to. No protocol required it. But in that simple, quiet gesture, everything converged. He said nothing, but his eyes, gazing down at the rippling water that mirrored the sky, spoke in his place. They were the eyes of a man who had just been given back a piece of his soul he thought was lost forever. And then, the skiff gently rocked. It began to drift, not by command, not by hand, but as if it knew exactly where it was meant to go. It glided forward, carried by the waves, like a final warrior pulling back, not in retreat, but in completion of his mission. No one left right away. Those on the dock, the sailors aboard the ships, and viewers from across the country all watched the small vessel until it became just a dot on the vast ocean. A single dot, but one that carried a legend, returned at last to its rightful place. Once a front line, now truly home. A week had passed, yet the echoes of that day's ceremony had not faded. The video capturing the moment Luther McNeel was returned to the sea, escorted by a fleet of patrol vessels, had spread like an unstoppable wave. It wasn't just quietly shared across social media. National television picked it up, followed by local stations across the country, each replaying it with the same moving caption. One soldier, one skiff, one memory that must never be forgotten. Everywhere, people talked. Journalists showed up. In schools, teachers told students about the veteran whose name isn't in the textbooks, but who now lives forever in the heart of America. Cars from neighboring states began pouring into Chesapeake Bay, but they weren't there for photos or autographs. They came to see him, the old man in the wooden boat. They came to silently watch him row out each morning, then return at dusk, the golden light trailing behind his quiet steps back to the familiar dock. And yet, in the midst of this wave of tribute, Luther remained unchanged. He gave no interviews, stood on no podiums, accepted no plaques of gratitude. He began each day as he always had, checking his oars, wiping the salt from the skiff's surface, and rowing out, not to fish, not to enjoy the view, but simply to sit there, still and quiet in the open sea, as if speaking with voices only he could hear. By evening, he returned, his shoulders tired but steady. Each step on the wooden dock landed like the cadence of a marching drum. He would sit down, place a cloth on his lap, and begin to polish each plank of wood, gently, patiently, as if every grain and scar told a piece of memory worth preserving. When someone approached and politely asked, "How do you feel after everything that's happened?" he didn't say much. He just shook his head, eyes never leaving the hull of his boat. Then, in a voice so soft it nearly vanished into the wind, he replied, "I just want to remember my friends, those who didn't get to come back like I did." No further explanation was needed. In one simple sentence, he had spoken for thousands, those who never made it home, and those who did, carrying with them a silent grief. He never wanted to be remembered as a hero. He only wanted his friends not to be forgotten, not through monuments, but through quiet presence, amid waves and wind, and the ordinary things they gave their lives to protect. And perhaps that is the most important thing of all. Luther's story is not a case of delayed recognition. It is a wake-up call, a gentle yet undeniable reminder that memory must be preserved and gratitude should never have to wait. We don't need holidays to honor them. We don't need fireworks or anthems to say thank you. Every veteran, whether living or laid to rest, deserves to be honored, not only in war, but in the quiet rhythms of everyday life. Not just because they once held a weapon, but because they once upheld a vow to live for others. Share this story with your family and friends across America. If you believe that no sacrifice is too small, if you believe that gratitude should never arrive too late, then help this story be heard. Because sometimes the smallest gesture is enough to remind someone that their memory still lives on. And don't forget, subscribe to Veteran Best Stories, where the stories may not be found in history books, but they live forever in the heart of America.